The snow was still falling that morning, blanketing the Ardennes in a deceptive calm. Smoke from burned-out tanks curled lazily into the sky, twisting through the forest like ghosts of the fallen. It was December 1944, deep in the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, where every road, every hill, every tree line became a front line. Inside a muddy American camp, a young Sherman tank driver named Corporal James "Red" Vickers tightened his gloves and squinted toward the tree line. His unit had been battered for days, outnumbered, low on fuel, and cut off from command. The Germans were pushing hard, determined to split the Allied front. For Red and his crew, there was only one way out: fight or be crushed beneath the tracks of the Wehrmacht's advance. Moments later, they heard it, the deep rhythmic growl of diesel engines rolling closer. A German convoy, half-tracks, armored trucks, and a pair of Panzer Rifles was crawling down the forest road, unaware that a single American tank lay hidden on their flank. Red's commanding officer gave a simple order: hold position. But Red didn't listen. Instead, in a split-second decision that would later be called insane, he gunned the Sherman's engine, swung the tank out of cover, and charged sideways into the convoy, straight into the jaws of the enemy. What followed was less a battle and more a storm, a brutal, chaotic eruption of fire and steel that stunned both sides. The Germans didn't see bravery that day. They saw madness, and then their entire convoy go up in flames. This is the story of one man's reckless courage, and how a single act of defiance turned the tide of a doomed encounter. The Ardennes forest in December 1944 looked almost peaceful from a distance, a quiet stretch of snow-draped pines and winding roads, frozen under a pale winter sun. But to the soldiers who crouched in those woods, it was anything but calm. Beneath the white stillness lay chaos. The Battle of the Bulge had erupted only days before, and it was already being called Hitler's last gamble, the final, desperate attempt to turn the tide of World War II in Germany's favor. The attack came like thunder. On December 16th, more than 200,000 German troops surged through the dense forest, supported by tanks, artillery, and the remnants of the Luftwaffe. Their goal was bold: split the Allied lines, drive west to Antwerp, and force the Americans and British into surrender. The plan's success depended on speed, secrecy, and surprise, and in the first few days it worked. Entire American units were overrun. Towns that had been secure one morning were burning by nightfall. Soldiers who had spent months believing victory was near suddenly found themselves retreating, cut off or surrounded. Among them was a young tank driver named Corporal James "Red" Vickers, a man who had spent most of his short life fixing engines in Ohio before finding himself behind the controls of a Sherman tank somewhere in Belgium. His crew had been fighting for days, through fog, snow, and artillery fire, trying to hold what little ground they could. Their tank, nicknamed Liberty Bell, bore the scars of it all: scorch marks from near misses, a cracked periscope, and paint stripped by shrapnel. They were attached to the 7th Armored Division, a unit that had been tasked with holding the road network around the strategic town of St. Vith. The Germans wanted it badly. It was one of the few road junctions that could support their supply columns moving west. Without it, their offensive would bog down. With it, they could break through to the Meuse River and possibly even beyond. For Red and his crew, that meant one thing: they were right in the path of the storm. The days blurred together in a haze of snow and exhaustion. The forest seemed alive with movement: the crunch of boots, the distant growl of tanks, the echo of gunfire bouncing between trees. Supplies were running dangerously low. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel was precious enough to be guarded like gold. Every shell fired, every mile driven was a decision weighed against survival. By the 4th day, Red's unit had been forced to fall back to a cluster of ruined farmhouses overlooking a frozen ravine. The ground was hard as iron, the cold biting through even the thickest gloves. Around them, other American units dug in where they could, forming what commanders later called a temporary defensive screen. In truth, it was a desperate attempt to slow the German advance, a wall of men and steel stretched too thin to hold. That morning, Red climbed out of his tank to scan the horizon. Smoke drifted from the trees where artillery had landed hours before. The faint hum of engines could be heard somewhere in the distance, steady, mechanical, rhythmic. German engines. He could feel it in his chest before he even saw them. The enemy was coming again. Inside the tank, his crew moved with practiced routine. Sergeant Don Tex Harris, the commander, checked the map for the 100th time, tracing their position with a pencil that had long since frozen stiff. Frank Doyle, the gunner, wiped frost from his sight, muttering that they only had 6 armor-piercing shells left. Eddie Monroe, the loader, rubbed his hands to keep warm, while Billy Rhodes, the radio operator, tried to raise headquarters through static and silence. No response came. They were alone. Red leaned against the turret hatch, staring at the snow-covered road that wound between the trees. Somewhere down that path, a German convoy was moving, trucks loaded with ammunition, half-tracks carrying infantry, and tanks protecting the column. The Germans were pressing west, confident and fast, believing the Americans were broken, but Red wasn't ready to give up. As he sat there, watching the distant tree line, he remembered something his father used to tell him back home. Sometimes, boy, when you can't outgun 'em, you outthink 'em. It sounded simple, even foolish in the middle of a war. But at that moment, surrounded and cut off, those words came back with surprising clarity. He knew that if they stayed hidden, the convoy would pass, but it would reach St. Vith and the roadblock would fall. If they opened fire from their position, they might destroy 1 or 2 vehicles, but then the Germans would return fire with everything they had, and the Liberty Bell would become a burning coffin. There had to be another way. He studied the terrain. The forest road ran alongside a low ridge, just high enough for a tank to move unseen above it. The Germans wouldn't expect a flank attack from that angle. It was risky, insane even, but it was the only way to hit them hard enough to make a difference. As he climbed back into the Sherman, Red's hands were steady on the controls. He didn't say a word at first. The others looked at him, waiting. "We can't stay here," he finally said. "We hit them from the side. Full speed. We catch them before they know what's happening." Tex stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "That's suicide, Red," he said quietly. Red just smiled a little. "Maybe, but it'll buy the others time." No one argued after that. They all knew the stakes. The crew braced themselves as Red started the engine. The familiar rumble filled the cabin, a sound that was both comforting and terrifying in its own way. Above them, the snow began to fall harder, the flakes swirling like ghosts in the cold wind. As the Sherman's treads began to turn, Red looked once more toward the forest and whispered under his breath, "Let's go make some noise." Moments later, Liberty Bell rolled out of the ravine, disappearing into the trees, toward the sound of German engines and the battle that would soon define them all. The snow crunched beneath the Sherman's tracks as it crept along the edge of the ridge, its engine humming low, steady, almost blending into the wind that swept through the Ardennes forest. Inside the tank, the air was thick with tension and diesel fumes. The men spoke little. Every breath fogged the metal walls, every movement echoed faintly in the confined steel shell. They all knew this was not an ambush ordered by command. This was something else entirely, a gamble born of desperation. Red's eyes stayed fixed on the periscope, scanning the forest road below. The narrow path wound between tall pines, their branches heavy with snow. Through the drifting flakes he could see it now, faint shadows moving in a column. First came the half-tracks, their open tops revealing German soldiers huddled against the cold. Behind them rumbled trucks laden with fuel drums and ammunition crates, and at the rear, 2 Panzer IV tanks, their turrets sweeping from side to side, alert but unaware of what lurked above. He counted at least 15 vehicles, too many for one Sherman to take head-on. But Red wasn't planning a head-on fight. His mind was locked on the ridgeline, narrow, uneven, but close enough to the road for his gun to reach. If he could keep the tank moving along it, they could strike from the side, like a wolf attacking a column of unsuspecting prey. Tex leaned over his shoulder, squinting through the vision slit. "That's a whole damn battalion convoy," he muttered. "You sure about this?" Red didn't look up. "No," he said plainly. "But I'm sure about what happens if we don't." Doyle, the gunner, adjusted the elevation on the 76mm cannon, his gloved fingers trembling slightly from the cold. "When do you want me to fire?" "Not yet," Red said. "Let them get closer. Wait until we can smell the fuel." The minutes dragged on like hours. The convoy was close enough now that they could hear the clatter of metal on metal, the murmur of engines, even the faint sound of German voices carried on the wind. Through the frost-glazed periscope, Red could see faces, weary, cold, unsuspecting. The soldiers were relaxed, believing they were deep inside friendly lines. The arrogance of success had dulled their caution. Then something shifted. One of the panzer commanders stood up in his turret, scanning the tree line with binoculars. For a heartbeat, Red thought they'd been spotted. He froze, holding his breath. The German's gaze swept past them, paused briefly, then turned away. That was all Red needed. "Doyle," he said quietly, "target that lead half-track. Copy that." Doyle's voice was calm now, steady, the voice of a man who'd accepted what was about to happen. He peered through the sight, made a micro-adjustment, and exhaled slowly. "On my mark," Red said. 3 seconds passed. The Sherman lurched slightly as its turret locked into position. "Now!" The 76mm gun thundered, shattering the silence. The shells streaked through the cold air and smashed into the half-track. The explosion was instantaneous, a burst of fire and debris that lit up the forest like lightning. The concussion rocked the Sherman, and the blast wave rolled down the convoy like a hammer strike. German soldiers shouted in confusion, scrambling for cover. Engines revved, brakes screeched. Red jammed the throttle forward. The Sherman leapt into motion, bursting from behind the ridge in a spray of snow. The Germans hadn't expected this. No one would have. A single tank charging down from the side, guns blazing as it was madness. Doyle fired again, the second shell striking a fuel truck. It erupted in a towering column of fire that consumed 2 nearby vehicles. Men ran, some firing blindly into the trees, others diving for the ditches. The smell of burning diesel filled the air, thick and choking. Red kept the Sherman moving, using the slope to his advantage. Each shot was fired on the move, the gun recoiling hard enough to rattle every bolt in the tank. Eddie, the loader, worked furiously, sweat dripping despite the cold as he slammed shells into the breach. "2 left!" he yelled. "Make them count," Red replied, swinging the tank to line up another shot. Doyle aimed at the rear panzer. The German tank's turret was turning now, desperately trying to bring its gun to bear. Doyle squeezed the trigger. The shell struck just below the turret ring, punching through the thinner armor. The explosion blew the hatch open, flames bursting from within. The panzer's crew didn't even have time to escape. For a moment it felt like they might actually pull it off. The German column was breaking, the road blocked by burning wrecks, the rest of the convoy scattering in panic. But then, from the far end of the road, the second panzer's gun flashed. The shell screamed past the Sherman, tearing through a tree and exploding behind them. The shockwave shook the tank violently. Billy, the radio operator, was thrown against the wall. "They've got our range," he shouted. Red gritted his teeth. Not for long. He gunned the engine again, turning sharply to the right. The Sherman's track slipped in the snow, metal grinding against frozen earth. He pushed it harder, closing the distance. Doyle loaded their second-to-last round. "AP ready," he called. The panzer's turret turned, but too slowly. Doyle fired. The shot hit the German tank square on the front plate. It didn't penetrate, but it stunned the crew, halting their aim. Red seized the moment, slamming the Sherman into a sideways skid that put them just off the road, broadside to the panzer. The loader dropped their final shell into the breach, a high-explosive round. Doyle fired. The shell struck the base of the panzer's turret. The explosion tore open the rear engine deck, and within seconds black smoke billowed out, flames licking at the snow-covered trees. The German convoy was in ruins. Half-tracks and trucks burned like torches. Men stumbled through the smoke, some firing, most running. The road was blocked, the forest filled with the stench of fuel and death. Inside the Sherman, the crew sat in stunned silence for a moment. The only sound was the crackle of flames outside and the rumble of their own engine idling. Doyle finally broke the silence. "You're out of your damn mind, Red," he said softly. Red didn't answer right away. He just looked through the periscope at the wreckage below. A once unstoppable German column reduced to chaos in a matter of minutes. Then he exhaled and said quietly, "Maybe, but crazy works." The tank sat there for a few moments longer before disappearing back into the smoke, leaving behind nothing but fire, steel, and disbelief in its wake. The battlefield was chaos, fire, smoke, and thunder all blending into one. The Germans were shouting orders in every direction, their convoy torn apart and burning. Black columns of smoke climbed into the cold sky as Red Vickers' Sherman tank roared through the haze, like an iron beast unleashed. Every sense was overwhelmed. The smell of burning fuel, the crack of rifle fire, the screams of wounded men echoing through the forest. The snow that had blanketed the ground only minutes earlier was now churned into black slush, soaked in oil and blood. Red gripped the controls tightly, the vibrations of the engine buzzing through his arms. His mind was locked into instinct now, not training, not logic, just the primal rhythm of survival. Around him, his crew worked like a single machine, each man moving in sync with the others. Doyle, the gunner, barked coordinates as he adjusted the turret. Eddie slammed another round into the breech, and Tex shouted targets from the commander's cupola, his voice raw over the deafening roar of battle. "Truck on the left," Tex yelled. "Got it," Doyle replied. He pulled the trigger, and the Sherman's cannon boomed, hurling another 76mm shell downrange. It struck a munitions truck dead center. The explosion that followed was enormous. A blinding flash lit up the forest, followed by a shockwave that rocked the Sherman on its treads. Shards of metal and burning debris rained down from the trees. Red turned the tank sharply, the engine growling as the treads bit into the frozen mud. A German machine gun opened up from somewhere in the smoke, the rounds pinging harmlessly off the Sherman's frontal armor. "Hold her steady!" Doyle shouted and fired again. The cannon's recoil jolted the entire crew. Another explosion, another German position silenced. But Red could feel the danger closing in. The Germans were regaining their footing. Somewhere in the chaos, a Panzer IV that had survived the ambush was now angling its turret toward them. The deep rhythmic sound of its gun traversing sent a chill through everyone in the tank. Red knew that if the Panzer got a clean shot, the Sherman wouldn't stand a chance. Its armor was no match for a direct hit from a German 75mm Panzer. 2 o'clock. Tex shouted. Red didn't hesitate. Evasive. The Sherman lurched forward just as the German tank fired. The enemy shell screamed through the air and slammed into the ground barely 15 feet behind them, exploding in a burst of snow and dirt that rattled the hull. The shockwave threw Billy against the radio console, sparks jumping from the damaged wiring. "We can't take another one like that," he yelled. Red's jaw tightened. "We won't." He swung the Sherman around a burning truck, using the wreckage as partial cover. The heat from the flames was intense, baking the side of the tank as they rolled past. Doyle lined up the German Panzer through the sight, but the smoke made visibility almost impossible. "I need a clearer line," he shouted. "Then I'll get you one," Red said. He jammed the throttle forward, sending the Sherman sliding down the embankment toward the road. The tank's massive weight crushed debris under its treads as it burst from the tree line. For a split second, the two tanks faced each other across the snowy road. The American Sherman, blackened and battered, and the German Panzer sleek and deadly, its cannons swinging toward them like a predator, locking onto its prey. The world seemed to slow. Doyle's hands tightened on the firing lever, his breath steady despite the chaos. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Just a second more." The Panzer's gun fired first. The shell struck a tree to the Sherman's left, showering them in splinters and dirt. "Now," Tex shouted. Doyle fired. The 76mm round flew true, striking the Panzer squarely beneath its turret ring. The explosion ripped through the German tank, blowing the hatch open as flames poured out. The Panzer's turret tilted and then froze, smoke gushing from every seam. The Sherman crew cheered instinctively, the momentary triumph cutting through the fear. But Red didn't slow down. "Keep moving," he ordered. "We're not out yet." The convoy was still smoldering, trucks burning, soldiers scattering, the once orderly column reduced to wreckage. Yet through the smoke, more movement appeared. German infantry were regrouping near the far end of the road, setting up anti-tank guns. Red saw them and knew what would happen next. One well-placed shell from those guns could end it all. "Tex, call it." Red barked. "Far end near the second truck, Pack 40 setting up." Tex yelled. Doyle swung the turret, but they were low on shells. Eddie scrambled through the storage rack. "One, he left," he called out. "Then make it count," Red said. Doyle aimed carefully, adjusting for the slope. On the way, he fired. The shell streaked through the smoke and struck the ground just behind the German gun crew. The explosion sent men and equipment flying. The anti-tank cannon flipped onto its side, silenced before it could fire a single round. That one shot sealed it. The last organized resistance broke apart. The remaining Germans fled into the forest, abandoning vehicles and equipment. The once confident Convoy, the same that had rumbled forward with precision and discipline only minutes earlier, was gone, consumed by panic and flame. Inside the Sherman, the crew sat in stunned silence, the adrenaline slowly fading. Red's hands trembled slightly on the controls. His knuckles were white. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest. Doyle leaned back from the gun sight, exhaling hard. "Jesus," he muttered. "We actually did it." Billy laughed shakily, his nerves catching up with him. "I thought we were done for. I thought that last one was going to take our turret clean off." Tex wiped sweat and grime from his forehead, his voice low but steady. "We just took out an entire convoy," he said. "With one tank," Red didn't answer. He stared through the periscope at the burning road below, the bodies, the twisted metal, the flickering firelight reflecting off the snow. The smell of smoke and diesel filled his lungs. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. He took his hands off the controls and sat back, closing his eyes for a moment. "Let's not stick around for the encore," he said finally. As the Sherman turned and crawled back toward the tree line, the snow began to fall again, covering the wreckage in a soft white blanket, as if the forest itself were trying to hide the scars of what had just happened. The forest was eerily quiet now, broken only by the distant crackle of fires and the low rumble of the Sherman's engine as it crept through the aftermath of destruction. The once orderly German convoy was gone, obliterated, scattered, or burning. Trucks were overturned and charred, their cargo spilled across the snow. Weapons lay half-buried in the mud, and the few surviving soldiers had fled into the woods, leaving behind only silence and smoke. Red Vickers and his crew sat inside their Sherman, staring out through the narrow slits of their vision ports, still trying to process what they had done. The battle had lasted less than 20 minutes, but it had felt like hours, an eternity of noise, fire, and fear. Tex broke the silence first, his voice low and hoarse. "So you think any of them made it out?" Red didn't look up from the periscope. "Some, but they won't be coming back." Eddie the loader was sitting on the floor of the turret, wiping sweat and grime from his face with an oil-stained rag. "We're almost dry," he muttered. "One armor-piercing left, maybe 2 HE shells. We burned through nearly everything." "Good thing we didn't need more," Doyle said quietly. He was still staring through the gun sight, almost afraid to look up, as if another target might suddenly appear out of the smoke. Outside, the snow began to fall again, faint flakes drifting down onto the scorched landscape. The cold air rushed in through the tank's vents, carrying the sharp scent of burnt rubber and diesel. Red knew they couldn't stay there. The explosion and fire would draw attention. German patrols were bound to come searching. They had to move, and fast, but as the Sherman rolled forward, Red noticed something strange, a faint flicker of movement near one of the destroyed trucks. He slowed the tank, squinting through the periscope. The wrecked transport was barely recognizable, its frame twisted, its cargo scattered. But there, crawling out from beneath the shattered side panel, was a German soldier. His uniform was blackened with soot, his helmet gone, his face streaked with blood. He was unarmed and stumbling, dazed and coughing. Red's finger hovered near the trigger of the coaxial machine gun. The crew fell silent, watching. The German stumbled toward the edge of the road, clutching his side, limping through the snow. Eddie spoke softly. "Orders say we don't leave survivors," but Red didn't move. His eyes followed the wounded man. The German collapsed a few yards from the burning wreck, lying motionless in the snow. "He's not a threat," Red said finally. Tex glanced at him. "He's also not our problem. Let's move." The tank rolled forward again, its treads crushing frozen branches as they turned down a narrow side road. The forest grew denser, the air colder. In the distance, they could still hear the muffled echoes of fighting. The front line was somewhere to the west, maybe a few miles away. They were deep behind enemy lines now, farther than any tank crew was supposed to be. "Think command even knows we're out here?" Billy asked from the radio seat. His headset was filled with static. The long-range comms had been damaged during the firefight. Red exhaled slowly. "Probably not. And if they do, they'll assume we're gone." No one replied. The engine's rumble filled the silence. It was strange, the way quiet could feel heavier than battle. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a creeping sense of isolation. The realization that they were alone in hostile territory, low on fuel and ammunition, and cut off from their unit. After a few miles, they came across a small clearing, a broken-down farmhouse with a barn beside it, half collapsed under the weight of snow. Red slowed the Sherman and parked it behind a thicket of trees for cover. "We'll stop here," he said. "Check for supplies, see if there's anything we can use." Tex and Eddie climbed out first, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. The cold hit them instantly, biting through their coats. The air smelled of smoke and pine, and somewhere nearby a crow cawed. The farmhouse was deserted, its windows shattered, doors hanging crookedly on their hinges. Inside they found only remnants: a table overturned, some empty cans, a burnt stove. "Looks like the Germans already cleaned it out," Tex said. Eddie nodded, his breath visible in the cold air. "Figures! They probably used it as a command post before pulling out." Red joined them, scanning the tree line. The landscape stretched out in all directions, silent and lifeless. He could see the faint outlines of tire tracks heading north, the direction the convoy had been traveling before they hit it. Somewhere up that road, deeper into Germany, was the destination the fuel was meant for. Maybe it had been intended for a retreating armored division, or one of the last pockets of resistance still holding out. Either way, it was gone now. He turned back toward the tank. Doyle was sitting on the turret, smoking a cigarette, staring into the horizon. "You know," he said quietly, "we just took out enough fuel to run half their tanks for weeks. That convoy was their lifeline." Red nodded. "Yeah, and now it's ashes." For a moment, none of them spoke. The magnitude of it hit them slowly, the scale of destruction they had caused, and what it meant for the war. That single act might have crippled an entire German unit. They had struck a blow that would echo far beyond that frozen forest. But with that realization came something heavier, the weight of knowing how many lives they had ended in the process. Eddie broke the silence. "You ever think about what happens to them? The ones we hit?" Red didn't answer right away. He looked back at the road, at the column of black smoke still rising in the distance. "I try not to," he said finally. "If you start thinking about it, you don't last long out here." Tex tossed a piece of broken wood into the snow. "War doesn't give you time for thinking," he said. "You just do what you have to do." But even as he said it, they all knew that wasn't entirely true. The faces of the men they'd fought, the ones running, screaming, burning, would stay with them. They always did. That night, as darkness fell, they camped near the barn. The fire crackled weakly, casting long shadows on the tank's hull. The snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, covering the battlefield behind them like a shroud. Red sat alone for a while, staring into the flames. His mind replayed the chaos again and again, the roar of the cannon, the explosion of the Panzer, the German soldier collapsing in the snow. Somewhere far away, artillery thundered. The war was still raging, but for a brief moment, in that lonely forest clearing, time seemed to stop. The fire's warmth flickered across Red's face, and in the quiet, he finally allowed himself to feel what he'd buried all day. Not pride, not triumph, but exhaustion, he whispered under his breath. Almost to himself, "We did what we had to. That's all." And in the distance, the wind carried the faint echo of engines, not German this time, but American. Reinforcements, maybe, or ghosts of machines still fighting in the snow. At dawn, the forest was wrapped in a thin, ghostly fog. The Sherman tank sat half-hidden among the pines, its steel hull dusted with frost. Red Vickers had barely slept. He'd spent most of the night listening, to the faint rustle of the trees, to distant explosions far off toward the front, and to the constant ticking of the tank's cooling engine. Every sound carried meaning out here. Every echo could be a patrol, a vehicle, or death creeping closer. When the first light broke through the branches, the crew stirred. Tex yawned and adjusted his jacket, brushing away snow that had drifted onto his shoulders. "Feels like we're the last tank left in Europe," he muttered. Eddie climbed down from the turret, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Wouldn't surprise me," he said. "After yesterday, I figure we used up all our luck." Red didn't respond. He was studying the map laid out on the hood of the tank, a wrinkled, dirt-stained paper showing the dense Ardennes forest. The road they had ambushed the convoy on cut diagonally across it, leading deeper into enemy territory. If his estimate was right, they were at least 15 miles behind German lines, too far to call for help, too close to run. They had two choices: wait for the Americans to push forward and hope to be found, or take the risk and move toward friendly territory themselves. But moving meant exposure. It meant fuel consumption, noise and danger. The Sherman's fuel gauge already sat near empty. Red knew they couldn't afford to get stranded. As he traced the route with a gloved finger, Doyle leaned over his shoulder. "What's the plan, Skipper?" Red sighed. "We head west, small trails, back roads. If we move at night, we might slip through without drawing attention. We can't stay put. The Germans will be looking for whoever hit that convoy." Tex gave a grim chuckle. "Guess we gave them reason enough." Eddie looked uneasy. "And what if they find us first?" Red folded the map. "Then we fight, like we always do." By mid-morning, they were moving again. The Sherman rolled slowly down a narrow dirt path, its engine humming low. Smoke still lingered in the distance, the wreckage of the convoy now a black scar across the forest. Every few hundred yards, Red stopped to listen, scanning for the sound of enemy vehicles or boots crunching on snow. But the woods remained eerily quiet. Inside the tank, the atmosphere was heavy. No one spoke much. The smell of oil and gunpowder still clung to everything. The walls of the steel giant felt closer than usual, almost suffocating. Doyle kept his eye to the periscope, scanning the tree line for movement. Billy fiddled with the broken radio, trying in vain to catch a signal through the static. After an hour of crawling through the forest, they came upon something unexpected. A small bridge over a frozen creek, and beyond it, the faint outline of a village. Smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys. Civilians, maybe, or German troops using it as a forward post. Red halted the tank and studied it through his binoculars. "Could be a trap," Tex said. "Too quiet." "Or a chance," Red replied. "If it's civilians, maybe we can trade for food or fuel." "We can't make it far on what we've got." The decision wasn't easy. Every instinct told Red to avoid contact. But they were running on fumes. He finally ordered Doyle to keep the gun ready and Tex to drive forward slowly. The Sherman crept toward the village, its treads cracking the thin ice on the road. As they entered the outskirts, it became clear the place had been abandoned, at least mostly. The houses were empty, windows shattered, doors hanging loose. The war had swept through here not long ago. A burnt German half-track lay overturned near a well, its tires blown, the insignia barely visible through the soot. Eddie climbed out to investigate, stepping carefully through the snow. He peered inside the vehicle, then called out, "Fuel drums! 2 of them!" Red's heart lifted slightly. "Check if they're full." Eddie unscrewed a cap and dipped a stick in, half full each. "Enough to get us out of here," Tex grinned. "Looks like luck hasn't completely left us." They began siphoning the fuel into the Sherman's tanks, working quickly. The whole time, Red's eyes stayed on the road ahead. Something about the silence didn't sit right with him. There were no birds, no voices, not even the creak of doors in the wind. It felt like the village itself was holding its breath. Then faintly, from somewhere to the east came the rumble of engines. Heavy ones, as not trucks, but armor. Doyle froze, his face going pale. "That's not ours," he said quietly. Red immediately barked orders. "Everyone inside, now." They scrambled back into the tank, sealing the hatches. The Sherman's engine roared to life, but Red didn't move it yet. Through the periscope, he could see movement between the trees, dark shapes advancing slowly. "Panzer IVs, Doyle said. 3 of them." Tex cursed under his breath. "Guess they found out who hit their convoy. They were outnumbered 3-1. Red knew the Sherman couldn't take a frontal duel with even a single panzer from this range. He thought fast. The village's narrow streets could work to their advantage, if they used them right. "Tex, back her up behind that barn. We'll use it for cover." "Eddie, load he. Target their flanks when they come through." The crew moved like clockwork. Fear sharpened every motion, but experience steadied them. The Sherman reversed behind the ruined barn, its barrel aimed toward the street. The rumble of the approaching panzers grew louder, echoing off the stone walls. Then the first German tank appeared, its turret scanning side to side. It hadn't spotted them yet. Red held his breath. The enemy tank rolled past the corner of the barn, just enough for the Sherman to see its exposed side armor. "Fire!" The cannon roared. The shell slammed into the panzer's side, detonating in a burst of fire and smoke. The explosion shook the ground. The second panzer turned its turret toward them, firing wildly. The round smashed into the barn, sending wooden debris flying, but the Sherman remained intact. "Reload." AP this time? Red shouted. Eddie rammed another shell into the breach, and Doyle fired again. The second Panzer burst into flames. The third German tank tried to back away, reversing toward the trees. Red saw his chance. Advance! Take him before he escapes. Tex gunned the engine, the Sherman charging forward through smoke and debris. The gun fired again, and the final Panzer vanished in a fireball that lit up the foggy morning. When the echoes faded, the crew sat in silence, breathing hard. Red finally spoke, his voice steady but quiet. So that's 3 less for the war. The others didn't cheer this time. They just sat there, staring out at the burning wrecks. The victory felt hollow, necessary but grim. As the flames flickered in the distance, Red realized something profound. Their mission hadn't just been survival anymore. Every move, every shot, was part of something larger. A slow, brutal tide pushing back against the darkness that had swallowed Europe. And though they were alone, stranded deep in enemy territory, they had just proved that courage, and one Sherman, could still turn the course of a battle. When the smoke finally cleared, the battlefield lay in eerie silence. The 3 burning German Panzers sent thick black columns of smoke spiraling into the pale sky, their twisted steel reflecting the glow of dying flames. The snow around them was melted and stained with soot and oil. The smell of war, burnt rubber, scorched metal, and gunpowder hung thick in the air. Inside the Sherman, the crew sat in stunned quiet, their faces lit by the dull orange light outside. For a long time, no one spoke. They were alive, somehow, but each man knew how close they had come to being nothing more than another blackened wreck in this forgotten village. Doyle was the first to break the silence. "We should have been dead 3 times over," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Guess someone up there likes us." Tex chuckled weakly. "Nah, it's Red. The man's got more lives than a damn cat." Red didn't smile. He was still watching the flames, deep in thought. The battle had bought them time, but time was running out. Their fuel was almost gone again, ammunition was low, and they were still far behind enemy lines. He knew they couldn't linger. German reinforcements would come. Where there were tanks, there would soon be infantry, and with them artillery and scouts. The forest would be crawling with men looking for the lone American tank that had humiliated a convoy and destroyed 3 Panzers in a single morning. He leaned over the radio, trying again to raise headquarters, but all he got was static. Billy twisted the dials, his gloves trembling slightly. "Nothing but ghosts out there," he whispered. "We're too deep. Maybe the lines have shifted." Red exhaled slowly. "Then we make our own way back." Tex looked over from the commander's hatch. "You sure about that?" "The Krauts'll have every road watched." "Doesn't matter," Red replied. "We keep to the forest. Move only at night. If we can reach the main highway by tomorrow night, we might find an American patrol, or what's left of one." Doyle sighed. "And if we don't?" Red glanced at him, eyes hard but calm. "Then we make it anyway." That was all that needed to be said. The crew trusted him. They always had. He had dragged them through mud, fire, and shell bursts, and somehow they were still breathing. That was enough. By the time night fell, the snow had started again, soft flakes settling over the blackened ruins. The Sherman moved quietly through the trees, its engine humming low, exhaust misting into the cold air. The light from the burning village faded behind them until it was just a distant orange glow on the horizon. Hours passed in near silence. Every man inside the tank was lost in his own thoughts. Eddie sat with his back against the shells, clutching his rifle like a charm. Doyle kept his hands near the gun, ready to fire at the first sign of trouble. Tex drove with a steady rhythm, his eyes half-lidded from exhaustion but his focus unbroken. Billy still fiddled with the radio, hoping for a miracle transmission. And Red watched the forest. Every shadow, every flicker, every sound. Around midnight, the sound of movement ahead made him freeze. He cut the engine instantly. The silence was deafening. They listened. The crunch of boots, voices speaking German, faint but close. A patrol. Red motioned for everyone to stay quiet. Through the periscope, he saw figures moving through the trees. 6, maybe 7 German soldiers, rifles slung over their shoulders. They carried lanterns, scanning the woods as they walked. One of them stopped and crouched, examining the Sherman's tracks in the snow. Red's heart pounded. If they followed the trail, the tank would be discovered. And once they fired a flare, The whole forest would come alive with enemy forces. They couldn't risk that. Doyle, Red whispered. Get ready to fire on my mark. He shall. Quick and clean. But before he could give the order, one of the Germans shouted, pointing toward the tank's direction. The others turned. Time was up. Now! Red shouted. The Sherman roared to life. The cannon fired with a thunderous crack, the explosion lighting up the forest like lightning. The shell struck near the patrol, scattering snow and debris. The Germans screamed and dove for cover, returning fire blindly. Machine gun rounds rattled off the Sherman's hull, but they might as well have been raindrops. Tex revved the engine, turning sharply to the right. "We're moving!" he yelled. "Hang on!" They barreled through the forest, crushing branches and snow beneath their treads. Another shot from the Sherman silenced what was left of the patrol. For several minutes they didn't stop, not until the gunfire had faded completely behind them. Inside the tank, the air was thick with cordite. Eddie coughed, wiping his face. "We can't keep doing this, Red," he said. "Every time we move, they're right behind us." "I know," Red replied. His voice was tired but resolute. "That's why we don't stop. We keep going until we find our lines." The rest of the night passed in a blur of exhaustion and tension. The men took turns keeping watch, though none of them truly slept. By morning, the snow had deepened, slowing their progress. The Sherman's engine sputtered more than once, threatening to die. But just as the first light touched the horizon, something appeared ahead, the faint outline of tire tracks leading west, and beyond them the glimmer of a road. Tex squinted through the frost-covered glass. "That's not a German road. Look at the ruts, trucks, maybe jeeps." Red's heart leapt. "That's ours." They followed the tracks for another mile, then heard it, distant voices, American accents, and the soft thump of boots. When the Sherman finally rolled out of the trees, a squad of U.S. infantry froze at the sight of it, rifles raised. Red popped the hatch and waved a gloved hand. "Friendly? 7th Armored," he shouted. The soldiers lowered their weapons, their faces lighting up with disbelief. "Hell, we thought you guys were gone." One of them yelled. Red smiled faintly. "Not yet." They climbed out of the tank one by one, stretching their legs for the first time in days. The wind bit at their faces, but it didn't matter. They were home or close enough. Behind them, the forest still burned in places, the smoke of battle rising slowly into the grey morning sky. That day, word spread quickly through the lines about a single Sherman that had ambushed a German convoy, destroyed multiple panzers, and fought its way back from behind enemy territory. It became one of those whispered stories soldiers told at night, half in awe and half in disbelief. For Red Vickers and his crew, there were no medals waiting, no grand ceremony, just another day in a war that had already taken too much. But deep down, each of them knew that what they had done mattered. One tank, 5 men, and a single act of courage had slowed a German push and saved untold lives in the process. And as Red watched the snow fall again that evening, he realized something. Wars were not won only by grand strategies or famous generals. Sometimes they were won by men who refused to back down. Men who drove straight into hell and came out the other side.